If you get to the end of your mix and you feel like your vocals are sounding too thin, this might be a mistake that you're making. A pretty common mistake that people make when they start mixing is they mix through all the instruments and they leave the vocals to the end. That means they get a really nice blend and mix of all the instrument sounds, and when it comes to the vocals at the end, there's not enough room in the mix for the vocal, and no room has been made for the vocal. So they'll start cutting into the vocal and EQing the vocal drastically to try and make the vocal fit in the mix. And by the time you get it to sit in there, it might actually be sounding quite thin and harsh. So what you should be trying to do is mix your vocals early on, getting a great vocal sound, and mixing everything else in around that vocal sound and making room for the vocal while mixing. Let me show you an example of a song that I mixed recently where I mixed the vocals earlier on and then I tweaked all the instruments around the vocals so that we had a nice, full, rich vocal sound in the mix. So check it out. Here's the track.
Oh, in my head I hear a calling for the show. Fragile mind, it is still open. Blissful through it all, so blissful through it all.
So you can hear the vocal's kind of the hero of this mix, you know, it's our main focus, which it should be. But then we've got this really nice finger-picking electric guitar and acoustic guitar driving along with some thundering kind of tom rolling drums. Now, the problem I found when I started mixing this was there was a lot of frequency masking going on in the area where the vocals were sitting coming from the guitars. So let me turn off the processing that I did to my guitars and you'll hear how all these frequencies start fighting with the vocal. Okay, so we've got our two main electrics and our acoustic guitar. So let's just turn off all of this processing minus some reverb here and have a listen to how this sounds now.
Oh, in my head I hear a calling for the show.
So it's not terrible, right? But as you pay attention to it, there's droning frequencies that are consistent all the way through. So there's some notes in the guitar playing that are held the entire time, which creates kind of a droning frequency, which can be distracting as it can poke through the mix a little bit. There's sort of some chimey high frequencies coming through on the electric guitar, which are kind of dissonant and kind of clashing with the vocal a little bit. And overall, like the mid-range is just a little bit cloudy. Now, if we mute the vocal and have a listen to the guitars and just the drums and the bass and all that stuff, you know, it sounds pretty cool. Like it's okay. Like there's no EQ on that at all at the moment. So you'd maybe do a little bit of EQ, but you'd maybe not carve enough space for the vocal if it wasn't in the mix while you're mixing those guitars. So by having that vocal sitting there in the mix, kind of how I want it to sound, and listening to the guitars around it, I can identify those problem frequencies and start pulling that stuff a bit more out of the guitars rather than chopping the vocal up to try and make the vocal fit in the mix. So let me just put that processing back on the guitars now, and you'll hear all those sort of mid-range frequencies that are fighting the vocal disappear a bit more, and the guitars open up and we scoop out some of that mid-range stuff and cut some of those droning frequencies and let the vocal shine through a whole lot better. So here's without processing.
Oh, in my head I hear a calling for the show.
With processing.
Oh, in my head I hear a calling for the show. Fragile mind, it is still open. Blissful through it all, so blissful through it all. All this love is still taking such a toll. And if I knew which path was breaking.
So we take a quick look at our acoustic guitar here. We've got kind of a big cut at 745 hertz. So we've probably got a droning frequency going on here. Let's play the track.
Calling for the show.
And when the processing's turned off, I could hear that frequency just droning through, and it's quite distracting. So doing a cut like that on a droning frequency automatically clears up that mid-range quite a lot, cutting away some like 400 hertz, dealing with some low-end rumble stuff here, and just a bit of a wide broadband scoop in the mid-range. We're just making space for the vocals because the vocals predominantly sit in that mid-range. And similarly with the electric guitars, if we have a look over here, we're just carving out this mid-range in the electrics, and on Pro Q3, carving into some of these chimey upper mid frequencies that are just kind of poking out and fighting with the vocal a bit. So if you have a listen to these turned on and off on the electric guitar.
Oh, in my head I hear a calling from the shore. It's fragile mind, it is still open.
So it just makes that space for the vocal to sit in there a whole lot nicer without all of this cluttery distraction around it. The guitars sound a bit more open rather than super mid-focus and all these like little frequencies jumping in and out all the time. And that's just one example of how you would do this. Generally, I think it's a great idea to get a really good drum sound. I think drums and vocals are like the two heroes. You could have a really nice guitar tone, and then if your drums sound terrible, the mix is just going to not translate well. Like, it's not going to sound great, is it? But you could have an epic drum sound and an average guitar tone, but it's still going to sound great because those drums are going to be punching the mix along and making it sound big and full. I mean, obviously, you want everything to sound great, but my thoughts are that the drums and the vocals are the two loudest things generally in the mix, and you want those two things to sound great. So they're usually my starting points of the mix, drums and vocals, getting them sounding good, and then bringing everything in around that stuff and making room for the vocal in those mid-range instruments. So if you're mixing all your instruments first and then chucking vocals in at the end and wondering why it's not all coming together, bring your vocals into the mix earlier, get a great vocal sound, and start working the other instruments around it. And I think you'll find that at the end, everything sounds a whole lot more cohesive. Hope you guys found this useful. Make sure you hit like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.